Good morning, or I should say good afternoon. I think it's right at noon, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a few more people join us in the room. First of all, I want to thank you and welcome you to the virtual Six Bridges Book Festival. This is all uncharted territory for us. I'm sure you've heard that more than once a day for most of us. We're glad that you joined us this afternoon. And before we begin, let me remind you that you can, if you'd like to ask a question, please open your chat box and either address it to the panelists or to the entire attendee list. And you can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on your questions, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, and while this year's festival is very important, we couldn't do it without our sponsors. We depend on the support of all of those community partners who are willing to support literary efforts in our community. My name is Marci Robertson, and I am the Executive Director of Literacy Action of Central Arkansas, and our main offices are housed in the Central Arkansas Library System's main library. And we are a sponsor of the Six Bridges Book Festival. We typically host the hospitality room for the authors and the volunteers. And while we miss seeing all of those folks in person, physical distancing means that I didn't have to spend nearly as much time baking and cooking and setting up food for all of the hungry authors and the volunteers this year. So let's meet our author for this session. Dr. Andrew Milson is a professor at the University of Texas at Arlington, and y'all don't hold it against him because he is from Texas. He says he has Arkansas roots, and he may be explaining that a little more in depth. He has a PhD from the University of Georgia and a BA and a master's in education from the University of North Texas. See, that's not too far from Arkansas. He currently studies 19th century travelers in the United States and the environmental and cultural perceptions evident in their writings. The book he's discussing today is titled Arkansas Travelers, Geographies of Exploration and Perception. So here's the nice, pretty, shiny book cover, 1804 to 1834. Dr. Milson maps the travels and perceptions of William Dunbar, Thomas Nuttall, Henry Rose Schoolcraft, and George William Fanshawe. And we're going to talk about that pronunciation as we get into this session because people might be surprised. So we'll let him explain the spelling and pronunciation later. Arkansas Travelers won the 2020 J.G. Ragsdale Prize from the Arkansas Historical Association. Dr. Milson has been recognized twice by the Journal of Geography with the annual Best Article Award and is a consulting author of a middle school world geography textbook and global issue reader series as part of National Geographic. Dr. Milson comes from a family of educators, which we all love to hear. His father was a professor and chair of teacher education at the University of Texas at El Paso for 30 years. His mother was a high school English teacher and librarian, other areas that are dear to our hearts. Before he joined UT Arlington faculty in 2010, Dr. Milson was a middle school social studies teacher and held faculty positions in teacher education at Northern Illinois University, Baylor University, and the University of North Texas. So we know he's a patient man if he taught middle school students in any topic. He enjoys teaching courses in human geography, historical geography, and regional geography for undergraduate students at UTA. He's been honored for his dedication by teaching by the UTA College of Liberal Arts and the National Council for Geographic Education. Welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival, Dr. Milson, and we wish you could be here in person, but I think that you maybe have a reading to begin with, unless you'd like to say something else to the attendees.
Well, thank you, Marcie, and thank you for everybody at Central Arkansas Library System and all of the sponsors and so forth. I wish we could be in Little Rock, obviously, back in April, but this will have to do for the times we're living in. So, yeah, I'll start with a passage from the book, and then I'd like to kind of show a few maps because I'm a geographer, so maps are very important to the purpose of the book for what I was trying to do. So this is in the section on Henry Rose Schoolcraft. After setting another new course, Henry Levi spotted 4 bears in trees along their path. Reflecting on the trip so far, Henry remarked, "We have not thought to go out of our way for the purposes of hunting, but this was too fine an opportunity to exercise our skill in hunter sport to be neglected." The men decided to give the bears battle. After tying their horse to a sapling and loading their guns, they approached their prey. The bears quickly spotted Henry and Levi and began to climb down from the trees. Henry and Levi decided to charge toward the bears in a clumsy attempt to keep them in place. But while running across the rugged ground, Levi sprained his ankle and fell. As the last of the bears hopped to the ground, Henry fired his gun from 50 yards away and missed. The bears loped away over a ridge and into a field of tall grass. Henry and Levi spent an hour trying to sight the bears again, but succeeded only in becoming exhausted and aggravating the injury to Levi's ankle. Henry confessed that the bears certainly were victorious. Thus far, the day involved a growing trepidation regarding their whereabouts and an ankle injury. By mid-afternoon, Levi was in severe pain and unable to put weight on his ankle, so they found a place to camp in a nearby valley. Henry began to worry. What if Levi's condition worsened? Was his life in danger? All they had packed for medicine was a box of Lee's pills and some healing salve. The pills were for indigestion or nausea, and the salve was for scratches and cuts. Neither would do much for the pain of an ankle injury or worse. Henry prepared a warm saltwater bath for Levi's ankle, wrapped it in flannel and buffalo skin, and assembled a bed of skins and grass. Henry's anxiety grew as he began to gauge their circumstances. They were without sufficient medicine. They were not sure of their location. They did not know if there were other people in the vicinity. There was not enough forage for the horse nearby. The wood close to the camp would not last very long. And what about food? Their provisions might not last for a week, and there did not seem to be many deer or turkeys in the area. Regardless of the presence of wildlife, though, Henry and Levi just experienced a rude lesson in how ineffective they could be at hunting. With these thoughts racing through his mind, Henry sauntered with his gun through the grass within earshot of the camp and looked for small birds that he might be able to shoot for supper. He came back to camp empty-handed and fed Levi a meal of coffee and biscuits. So that's just a scene from the Schoolcraft chapter, and I tried to kind of bring the reader into the moment a bit and feel sort of what these travelers were experiencing as they moved across these various parts throughout Arkansas and Missouri. So Marcie, would you like for me to show some of the maps now, or do you want to go to some questions and come back to the maps later?
If you have something specifically related to Schoolcraft, that would be great. And I found that interesting that you chose to focus on bears because, as you know, we talked about this a little bit, and I'm much more familiar with Gerstacker, Wild Sports in the Far West, and a lot of his was about hunting and the game and the bears, and most of you probably know that Arkansas was known as the bear state at one time. So I think that's very appropriate that that's what you chose to start with.
So Schoolcraft is one of the authors in the book. One of the travelers in the book. The others are William Dunbar, Thomas Nuttall, and George Fanshawe. I know it looks like it should be Featherston Hall, but the man apparently pronounced his name Fanshawe, so I'm not going to argue with that. And so part of the purpose for the book came from what I think of as sort of a cartographical problem. And so if we look at a map like this, we can see the lines on the map showing where these 4 men traveled. But these lines on the map don't tell us a whole lot about what they saw there, what they perceived, what they wrote about, and so forth. So Schoolcraft in particular is kind of famous for making some rather juicy insults about the people that he met. This is actually up in Missouri, over the state line in near present-day Branson. But he was staying with a family, and he said, "The Sabbath is not known to him. All days are equally unhallowed, and the first and the last day of the week find him alike sunk in unconcerned sloth and stupid ignorance. He neither thinks for himself nor reads the thoughts of others." But it wasn't all bad. He also had some positive things to say, particularly about the environment. He was really impressed with the Ozarks, the White River. He said the White River unites a current which possesses the purity of crystal with a smooth and gentle flow and the most imposing, diversified, and delightful scenery. Our canoe often seemed as if suspended in air, such as the remarkable transparency of the water. So I went through each of these 4 travelers, and I used Google Earth to map where they were at particular times using the clues I could find in the book. So I put these little place marks on the map. And then if it was something they said that was positive, I colored it green. If it was negative, I colored it red. If it was just sort of a descriptive statement where they didn't really pass any judgment, they were just describing what was there, then I colored it white. So you can see Schoolcraft's environmental perceptions through this region of Missouri. There's a lot of negative in here, but he's fairly positive when he's along the White River and on his way home, which I think is significant. He's more positive when he's on his way home. I also mapped the cultural perceptions, and this also gives you a sense for the area they traveled through here in central Missouri Ozarks, where there really weren't any settlements or any people. So I used those place marks then to create the maps that are in the book. And so my idea here was to try to put on the map not just where they went, but what they were saying, how positive or negative or just descriptive they were. And this gives us a little bit of a sense for some of the clusters of, negative, lots of negative comments in certain places, but also quite a few positive comments around the perceptions along the settlers along the White River, and definitely on his way back on the old Southwest Road as he's heading off to the northeast. So I mapped the cultural perceptions, positive, negative, and descriptive, and then I mapped the environmental perceptions, positive, negative, and descriptive. Kind of try to look at these travelers a little bit different. So I'll turn it back over to you, Marcie.
One of the things that I found interesting in the introduction, you focused on the 2 things: the place and the landscape. So, as I said earlier, geography is one of your areas, and so I think that the inclusion of the maps really helps us who may be more visual learners instead of just reading it, so that helps to track, especially with some of the place names having changed or having not even been named yet. But you want to talk a little bit about the perceptions that the writers have tended to be positive when it came to the landscape, but then when it came to the residents, not so much, which is something that we Arkansans tend to deal with. We're very protective of the PR of our state. Some of us choose to keep it on the down low to make sure that, a lot of people don't come in that we don't want, but then it's the natural beauty of the state is very apparent. But do you want to get into a little bit about what some of the variations were with the writers and what they felt about the natural landscape versus the settlements and the folks that were already here? And also they've asked if you can turn up your volume a little bit or speak a little louder.
Am I loud enough now? I think maybe I was just not talking as loud as I should. Is that better?
Let's see. Nobody has responded yet, but yeah, if you'll just speak a little louder, that may.
I tried to turn the volume up on the mic.
Okay.
I'm not sure what's up there. So yeah, the full travelers are coming at different times. And so this covers a 30-year period, but it's over a time when Arkansas culturally was transformed quite a bit. It goes from being a predominantly French and Indian society with very limited Anglo-American settlement to a lot of movement of people from the United States into Arkansas. And so over that period, you are going to have some different perceptions of the people that these travelers encountered. So place and landscape are both very important concepts for geographers. And so we think about place as kind of the question of what is it like there. And so you're describing your own perceptions and emotions that are evoked when you visit a certain place. The idea of landscape is sort of how has that environment been transformed by people? What kind of economic activities do they engage in? What kind of settlements have they built? And so forth. So I was looking at kind of what all of these different travelers were perceiving about the landscape and also their place perception, how they were describing those places. So one thing, of course, you might imagine when you take 4 white men from the early 19th century, they're going to have some certain attitudes about things. All but one of them had a background as an Englishman, so there were also some standard British English attitudes about Americans and so forth. And travel books also sold well. And so, like a lot of things, the more sensational they could make their story, the better their book might sell. And so at least 2 of them were very interested in selling their story, Schoolcraft and Fanshawe. And so I think that's also important for us to keep in mind.
And Dunbar coming from Scotland, I honestly, and with the number of Scottish residents that came to the Southeast United States, I can't imagine that it was the population was very much different than what he had in Scotland, honestly.
Yeah, well, and he came here as a 21 or something like that to sort of make his mark in the U.S. And then moved down from Philadelphia to Natchez, Mississippi, and became a big plantation owner. So he was, he was in essence, he had become a Southern, wealthy plantation owner by the time he did this tour.
So one of the things that we did as a history and museum community at the time of the Louisiana Purchase Commemoration, Arkansas, which has been more years ago than I care to count, we learned about a lot more about William Dunbar and George Hunter. There was even a local, I think the local AETN produced a film about that. And so someone has asked, they're saying that they viewed the historical marker in Arkadelphia about the Dunbar Hunter expedition. Where are other markers, especially in Arkansas, about this or related expeditions that are mentioned in the book?
That's a great question, and I didn't have a good answer to it. I didn't map the historical markers, but I know there's been some effort to try to map the Southwest Trail through Arkansas. I know there's signs along in Little Rock, and that was the pathway that Fanshawe took. I think at last time I visited Pinnacle Mountain, there was some stuff about Fanshawe and Nuttall having visited. So yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer to it.
I think that Mark Christ is in this session. Mark, do you have any comments or want to chime in here? And isn't the marker at Arkansas Post, is it still underwater part of the year? So if Mark Christ is in here, maybe you can help us out with some of that. So actually, and you mentioned Fanshawe, so tell them how his name is spelled.
It's spelled Featherston, huh?
Yes.
And I asked some of my colleagues in Scotland, how, and who are familiar with him and his writings. Everyone I've asked, has said, I don't have any, specific source that I can cite that says, this is how the man pronounced his name, but it's just sort of come down that that's the way he pronounced the name of it. And if you think about the way a lot of British cities and so forth are abbreviated, so that Leicestershire becomes Leicester or something, it's not unusual that it ends up being pronounced a little bit differently than it's spelled.
And Mark Christ has a question. How do you judge the 4 as writers?
But I think I enjoyed Schoolcraft probably the most in terms of just his ability to evoke the situation and so forth. Dunbar was really kind of writing a scientific report. Fanshawe can be, oh, I mean, really I selected them because all four of them are kind of fun to read. So I didn't dislike any of them. I guess Schoolcraft comes up as a top that I like a lot. I think of the people that I would have liked to have gone on, gone with them or something like that. Nuttall kind of strikes me as a guy who he was just so dedicated to botany and to studying, and he doesn't come across as quite as fussy as Fanshawe does, or as as lost or as naive as Schoolcraft.
So Sally Goss has commented, sounds like you did a lot of research for this book. How long did it take you to put it all together?
I worked on it for about 5 years. So that was from the first idea to sort of sorting out which four I was going to really focus on. A lot of my time was spent using Google Earth to map exactly where they were and what they said. And then just buckling down and cranking out the writing. So yeah, about 5 years.
What were some of the most useful sources that you found as far as your primary and secondary sources?
Well, I mean, certainly the journals were the top of the primary sources that I was using. There's also a lot of letters that Dunbar wrote. He corresponded with Thomas Jefferson while Jefferson was vice president, and then later when he was president. And it was while he was president that this trip that Dunbar took was funded. And so that correspondence there was very helpful. I was also able to get access to some letters that Fanshawe wrote to his publisher in Scotland. And they're still at the Scottish National Library of Scotland. And that had some interesting, statements about how he really wanted this to be a book that people would enjoy reading. He was going to kind of make people laugh at the Americans, and he didn't want to be unfair, but he also, thought there was a lot in the American character to laugh at. So in his handwriting, so that was pretty interesting.
Well, it seems to me that Dunbar and Fanshawe kind of had an knack for being in the right place at the right time in terms of the relationships they established. Like you just mentioned, Dunbar having a relationship with Thomas Jefferson. So how did those relationships happen?
Yeah, so that's a good, contrast among the four is that Nuttall and certainly Schoolcraft were much younger men. They were in their 20s. So I think Nuttall might have been 31. Dunbar and Fanshawe were older, in their 50s, which at that point in time was nearing the end of their life. Although Fanshawe lived to be about 80 or so. Fanshawe had worked his way into a position as the first geologist of the United States. And so he had been corresponding with men like James Monroe, and he knew John C. Calhoun and a lot of the people who were very important political figures in the United States. And so one of his first proposals as the new geologist of the United States was to make a trip to essentially the Ozarks and survey the land and provide a geological report on the possibilities for mining and mineral resources and so forth. And then so his book on his travels was just sort of more of a commercial opportunity than he took advantage of. Dunbar had established himself, like I said, as a wealthy plantation owner in Natchez. Thomas Jefferson was very interested to know to have a scientific survey of this area of Louisiana and Central Arkansas. The original plan, though, was sort of a Southwest version of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So if it had gone off as planned, the expedition would have followed the Arkansas River all the way up to its source, which they didn't know where the source was, and so they would have followed it all the way and ended up in Colorado, and then they were going to try to make an overland journey to find the source of the Red River, and take the lead back or something like that. So the trouble was a lot of this was officially Spanish territory. There were Native Americans like the Osage who were not at all going to, and certainly the Comanche and Apache, were not at all going to tolerate having some, expedition trudging through their territory. So, his was a smaller expedition than expected.
Right, as we were doing the Louisiana Purchase commemoration events, I did hear the Dunbar and Hunter Grand Expedition referred to as our own Lewis and Clark, although we never got to that level. And I think it seems to me that some of it was kind of piecemeal funding for one thing, because some of these folks were federally funded, and then some, what were their other sources of funding for these expeditions?
So Dunbar and Hunter were funded by Congress. And I think Dunbar asked for something like $12,000 and gave him $5,000. And so he wrote back, lots of letters complaining this isn't nearly enough money. He was supposed to do the expedition up the Red, try to go as far as he could, which would have taken him into the Texas Panhandle. The concern about encroaching on Spanish territory and encountering Native Americans, so forth, who weren't going to be friendly to them, made them change their mind. Jefferson essentially wrote Dunbar a letter that said, basically just use the money to go wherever you want to go to study something. And so he said, well, there's this, hot springs that we've heard about up in Arkansas. Maybe that would be a good scientific thing to go investigate. But that was essentially why he went to hot springs, to use the money he had been given, even though it wasn't really for the purpose. Schoolcraft, but his funding is kind of uncertain. Probably he got some of his money from the Austin family. So Moses Austin was active in mining in the Missouri Ozarks, and it was around this time that things were sort of falling apart. He was beginning to look at colonization possibilities in Texas, which his son, Stephen F. Austin, ultimately took over. But he stayed with, he and Schoolcraft and Stephen F. Austin were the same age. They were both 25 at the time. And so he probably, and the Austin family let Schoolcraft stay with him while he was in Potosi, Missouri. And then Nuttall was active in the American Philosophical Society, and he had sort of made a name for himself in Philadelphia as a botanist. And so he wanted to take an expedition to the Rocky Mountains and study, the garden of the Southwest, try to find new plant species and animal species. And so he wasn't able to get government funding, but he did get some funding from some of his associates in the American Philosophical Society. And then, like I said, Fenshaw was funded by the U.S. government in his role as the U.S. geologist to the United States.
So Nuttall couldn't get the federal funding, and yet he was, so that's what you said, and he was the curator of the botanical garden at Harvard.
Yeah.
That was impressive to me.
There's I couldn't find any real solid source to back this up, but one of Nuttall's biographers thinks that his English background might have had something to do with it. And so there's sort of these periods of xenophobia in the United States, and so there could have been a little bit of national prejudice against him. There also was, there were sort of shifting ideas about government funding of these things. During the Jeffersonian period, that was really popular. We have to do science, we have to send expeditions out there, we have to, try to claim this land. And I think, you know, as Congress does, right, it goes back and forth about things that it's going to support and not, you know, all kinds of politics about it. So, and that all was going right after the panic of 1819. So that it wasn't a great economic period for him to be getting government.
One of the questions we have, and it shifts focus a little bit, and we've talked a little bit about the folks already living in these areas, especially in remote areas of Arkansas. And I know that your writers had varying degrees of interactions with the Native Americans who are already in those areas. And Amy Clemmer has asked, did any of your writers go into detail regarding Indigenous perspectives of land and landscape?
Yeah, hi Amy. Yeah, Nuttall talks more about the Indigenous peoples because he traveled up and down the Arkansas River, and he spent quite a bit of time at Arkansas Post. There were some adjacent Quapaw villages. He actually made an effort to go and interview and talk with some of the people that he met. And then when he was up further, kind of between Little Rock and Fort Smith, there were Cherokee settlements there at that time. And so he visited the Cherokees and talked about essentially what they were up to. The Osage were the group that were kind of feared, rightfully so. And the only person that had an encounter with the Osage was Nuttall. And he was actually over in Oklahoma and came across an Osage village, and they tried to take the horse away and steal their canoe, and they sort of ran away and got away, but they were very afraid of what would happen. Schoolcraft was warned repeatedly by the white settlers throughout the Missouri, but don't go into Osage territory. That's, they had all kinds of stories about people, being murdered and tortured, and they were just not going to tolerate white encroachment. Very resistant to that, and he went anyway. He didn't run across anybody, but he did find some abandoned Osage camps, and he wrote kind of an interesting piece about the differences between the way he saw the Osage arrange their camps and how they interacted with the environment compared to what the white hunter does. So he sort of talked about Indians that were not present, whereas Nuttall talked about Indians that he actually, interestingly, Crenshaw doesn't say really much at all about Native Americans. And part of that is that by then most of the Native removal had occurred in Oklahoma. Dunbar runs across some Quapaw who are in partnership with French hunters, but not in any kind of law. It was very just sort of haphazard. You happen to cross paths with some people.
Susan Santa Cruz has asked, did these 4 authors also write of their travels to other areas of the country? Were there others who did this as fully as de Tocqueville?
Kind of
de Tocqueville.
I mean, nobody did it as well as he did. Yes, so Dunbar didn't travel anywhere else. He died pretty soon after this trip. Later in it, becomes an agent to the Native Americans of Michigan, and so he writes about his travels throughout upper Mississippi and along in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And Crenshaw, let's see, he also did sort of an expedition up the Mississippi. The other travels of these 4 men are not nearly as well documented as their Arkansas travels. So I would say that. But Nuttall appears as a character in it wasn't actually his writing, but another man who wrote about he actually did get to do his expedition out to the Rocky Mountains eventually, but it's through another person writing about Nuttall. I kind of summarized a little bit of that in the biographical section on Nuttall.
So Glenn has a question. It says, historically, the economy of Southwest and South Central Arkansas has been focused on forestry, petroleum, and some agriculture. What were the primary economic activities of the people during the time of this exploration?
So, in the Southwest, it was still predominantly farming, but he didn't run across yet the sort of settlements that developed a little bit later. The economic activities that are more prevalent were those along the White River and along Arkansas River, where there's a little bit of a skins and furs trade and whiskey and implements trade going up and down the river. So Schoolcraft talks quite a bit about the traders on the White River, and he friends some of them. And he actually gets he gets involved in a party that some of the traders are having in Batesville, Polk Bayou at the time. But yeah, so he tells some interesting stories about the traders. Yeah, it's really and up in the northeast. Schoolcraft was talking, with great admiration about the farming, the Kentucky and Tennessee settlers who were coming in and establishing farms.
Yeah, I guess it was a little early for the oil booms and busts that they had in the Smackover area.
Well, and it's funny that, they were looking, particularly Dunbar was looking for mineral resources. If he'd gone a little further, perhaps he would have gone across the diamond with so forth in Southwest Arkansas. He didn't, he kind of came back disappointed that they didn't find more mineral resources and better land in the area that he explored.
Let's see. Well, let me see if we have another question.
My volume better?
What was that?
Is my volume better?
I think there's a little bit of reverb. Susan Santa Cruz asked, what are your Arkansas roots?
My third great-grandfather, third and fourth great-grandparents, settled near Washington. They were on the Little Missouri River near present-day Blevins and the Elite. And so, but my second great-grandfather, who was born in Arkansas in 1847, moved to Texas during the Civil War. And so that branch of my family has been in Texas. So I can claim just a little tiny early connection there to Arkansas in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s. And that was really that was also part of my purpose in doing this book. Was I started reading Fanshawe because I knew he went through that area, and I wanted to see did he happen to run into my great-great-great-grandfather and have anything to say about him? Considering how insulting Fanshawe was, I'm probably glad that he didn't run into my family. But anyway, it's those are my roots as thin as they might be.
Yes, so Fanshawe's the one I believe you said had the residents of Arkansas had cultural deficiencies, which was an interesting phrase.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too. We kind of touched on it at the beginning that particularly for Fanshawe, he praised the people that he ran into that were of a higher class. He ran into lots of people in Southwest Arkansas, judges and lawyers and plantation owners and so forth that he was really impressed with, particularly the people in Spring Hill that the Virginians had settled and started up a church. And so there were places where he saw what he considered to be civilization. And so he was really impressed with that. And then when he saw poor people, or when he saw women that he thought weren't quite living up to what he thought a woman ought to do, and he's definitely very misogynistic in a lot of his comments. if he thought a woman was, too big or, seemed too manly or something like that, he was very insulting. When it was, the little lady who cooked us a nice supper, he was, he was very friendly about them. So like all of them, they had their biases. We can pick out all of the juicy insults, but we also have to remember they found people all throughout Arkansas that they were very impressed with. And they found environments that they thought were just right for economic development and scenic beauty.
I've found it interesting, kind of the later lives of some of these folks, especially Fanshawe. You would not have expected that someone who did travelogues basically of early Arkansas would end up with his. So would you say a little bit about what he did later in his life?
Yeah, so he was really busy traveling, doing these mineral sort of expeditions to look for mineral resources. So the government sent him out to Wisconsin and Minnesota. They sent him down to Georgia. It's interesting to me, I haven't quite developed this idea yet, but just about everywhere that he went was right on the cusp of Native American removal. And so I think there was something going on there. I just haven't quite put all the pieces together. The final straw, though, for him was they sent him to Maine. And they wanted to send him to Maine to do a geological survey of the boundary between Maine and New Brunswick. That hadn't been settled yet, believe it or not, in the 1830s. The international border between Canada and the United States was still unclear. So there were a lot of Americans who were moving further and further north into territory that the Canadians considered theirs. They wanted him to do a geological survey to establish where the border ought to be based on watersheds. And he didn't want to do something, because he was English, he didn't want to do something that might put him in bad, form with his countrymen. So he resigned as the U.S. geologist, and he contacted his friends in Canada and England and said, hey, I think this is a really good idea. I do want to do it for the Americans, but the British really ought to do a survey of this area and try to establish the boundary. So he got himself hired as a British, part of the British Foreign Service, and did the survey and made the recommendations. And he felt like the Americans had encroached too much on Canadian territory. It actually, Maine today, the border that was established was done there in 1842. Fanshawe was part of the British side of that argument, and he felt like Britain gave up too much. That some of that land that's northern Maine right now, according to Fanshawe, should be part of Canada. And then he got himself appointed as an ambassador in France, and spent most of his later life there. And in 1848, when all of the revolutions were going on in Europe, he actually helped the king and queen escape, the king and queen of France escape to England with the help of Queen Victoria. So he was involved in all kinds of crazy things. So this trip through Arkansas was just one of many adventures for him.
I think that would be an interesting. Are there other books about Fanshawe that you're aware of? That, I mean, I think he would be really interesting as someone who just keeps popping up incidentally in American history.
Yeah, I used a good biography. It's written by a couple by the last name of Berkeley, and I think that was. I want to say that was done back in the 60s or something like that, but I found it to be a pretty good biography. So it takes his entire life from his early days in England to coming to the U.S., going back to England, and so forth. Like I said, I think he lived to be 82 or 3 or something. So he had a long and interesting life.
And Brad, who's the coordinator of the book festival, has a similar question. In addition to your book, are there other books and or films that you think capture this period of exploration well, even if not centered in Arkansas?
great question. And, nothing really comes to mind. I guess, in some ways, I hope I was filling a little bit of a hole, but there's definitely a lot more that can be written. A lot of the writing about exploration, the stuff that seems to be book worthy has been on the West and the John Wesley Powell kind of thing. And so that's part of my interest in this project, was that I didn't really feel like Arkansas and Missouri had been given much attention. Sort of skipped from the Trans-Appalachian over into Texas and the West. I really liked, this is a popular nonfiction book, but Stephen Ambrose's book on the Lewis and Clark expedition was part of what kind of got me interested in travelers. That's Undaunted Courage. So yeah, films and so forth. I think Marci mentioned there was the film that was done by, I think, the Arkansas Humanities Council for the Dunbar expedition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so more of those kinds of things, reenacting or something like that.
And I think our local museums have covered some of those areas pretty well. As I said, the Museum of Science and History, which is now the Museum of Discovery, had a long-term Gerstacker exhibit. And then Historic Arkansas Museum, of course, is focused on Fanshawe, and a lot of their educational programs focus in that area, being territorial as their original mission. And they showed that film many times. I'm not sure, it may still be in rotation for some class groups as far as curriculum frameworks for student groups. So let me see. Marion Crawford asks, what led you to write this book?
So I guess it was a combination of things. It was honestly, part of it was my genealogical interest in my ancestors in Arkansas. They weren't wealthy or well connected, and so there really aren't a lot of records on them. And so I was trying to kind of understand what their lives might have been like. And so these travelers describe the sort of ordinary people that my ancestors were. Like I said, I was also really interested in travel and exploration, just reading about the trials and tribulations that people go through, particularly in the 19th century, makes, airport lines and that sort of thing seem kind of minor now. So that it kind of helps put things into perspective when you read about people's lives in the 19th century. And then also just my impression that when I read about particularly Schoolcraft, a lot of his quotes are used, understandably so, by Arkansas historians to, say what the culture might have been like or how it was perceived by this traveler. But I found that my first impression was, wow, this guy Schoolcraft was just really hard on everybody in Arkansas. He had nothing good to say. And, these travelers were just constantly insulting everybody and talking about how low and degraded and what a bunch of scoundrels and drunkards people in Arkansas were. So then I read their journals and I thought, oh, they weren't really quite that. I mean, yeah, they were negative, but not all the time. And so I kind of that's when my geographer brain sort of kicked in, and I said, all right, well, where did they say things that were negative? What was going on in that place? Who were the people they were interacting with that they were negative about? And who were the people they were interacting with when they were more positive? And so that, I guess, yeah, that's kind of what led me to kind of work on it.
Well, early in the book, you quote from the Arkansas Traveler, so you have the Arkansawyer in there, and I think I appreciated you kind of did a breakdown of both sides, that it can be perceived as a negative characteristic, but then it could also be in a positive. So you want to talk about kind of the dual nature of interpretation of the Arkansas Traveler, which most of us are pretty familiar with.
Yeah, so, there's a lot of versions of it, but the essential story is a traveler comes and there's, this backcountry settler, fiddling out a tune on his fiddle, and this traveler asks for lodging, and they go kind of this back and forth. It's sort of intended to be humorous, But yeah, it can be used to describe how backward and stupid these settlers were. But at the same time, there's also this interpretation that it's the freedom-loving Arkansas settler out in the backcountry, not taking any guff from this, urban guy who's lost. It's like, I'm not going to help you out. But then at the end, they all become friends because they start fiddling, and so they sort of transcend their differences by playing out a tune. So there, one of the things I did really quickly in the intro is say my purpose wasn't to kind of reinterpret that or to even extend that, but just the idea that that was also used for political reasons. Democrat sort of describing Jacksonian Democrats and that sort of thing at the time. Yeah, I wasn't really trying to reinterpret or re-examine that, but to just say, let's look at some actual travelers. And they did run into some situations like that that are similar to the old Arkansas traveler tale and song.
Susan Santa Cruz says, speaking as someone who loves maps, what other maps did you make for this book?
Most of them are just the maps of the travelers. And so I've got the overview maps that show their entire journey. And then I've got maps throughout the chapter about each traveler. I've got more focused maps, larger scale maps that show the specific route as best as I could retrace it, and some of the settlements that they went through. And then, like I showed at the beginning, I created those perception maps, which is kind of a new way to look at where they were positive, negative, or descriptive about the places.
And I told you this when we started early in our discussion, is that a friend of mine has for the Museum of Natural Resources, which used to be called Oil and Brine in Smackover. She, for their Chautauqua, portrayed Mrs. Dunbar. And so where are you? Are you on the side of Dinah or Diana Dunbar? Because I noticed, that you said it's written both ways. And this is Mark Christ and some of you Arkansas history folks will understand this question.
I completely dodged that one. I just said it was spelled both ways, and I have no idea whether she said Diana or Dinah. If Mark knows, that would be great. I don't know how she actually said her name.
Because my friend Pam Beasley, who did edit one of the journals that you cited, I think she contends that it's Dinah. Right. That's what she's always said, but So I just had that question. Let's see. Mark says no idea. Mark, you're a coward. You won't take a stand.
It's good that we're all in the same boat. We can all just go outside. I mean, unless you have somebody write down in a letter. People like to call me Diana, but my real name is Dinah. And
yes.
Up phonetically or something.
It's like the Maria versus Mariah.
Yeah, who would ever do that? So, as far as I know, Fanshawe never wrote anything that said my name is pronounced Fanshawe or Fenshaw or something.
And what was it? But his friends called him Finston.
His friends called him Finston, yeah. So Fenton, and so that's I use his nickname kind of in the chapter about him.
So we know when you do research like this, you kind of become personally engaged with the subjects you're researching. Were there any, you've talked about the negativity that some of them had towards Arkansas, the residents, if not necessarily the geographic areas. Were there any that you just really didn't like, the writers?
Benshaw's kind of hard to take. There's places in there where he's so snobby about, I got out my silk handkerchief and put it on the pillow, before I went to sleep, or, and so it's hard to know how much of that he was doing because he was trying to write for a British audience that wanted to kind of look down their noses at the Americans. How much of that is just part of his personality. But I think, you know, like I said, he doesn't seem like a guy I would have wanted to hang out with because he seems so fussy. Dunbar is also just kind of, you know, I mean, the fact that he was a major slave owner and just the way he seemed to not sympathize with the military men who were basically, you know, pushing his boat up the Ouachita River and going over rapids and risking their lives so he could have a little scientific glory. It's hard for me to, you know, to feel very much warm, fuzzy feeling about him. Although of course, I recognize, you know, he's a man of essentially the late 18th century, and so that's who he was. And not all on Schoolcraft, I kind of felt a little bit more affinity for him. So if I was
Dunbar the one that they were on a journey and then they came across an escaped slave? Was that Dunbar?
yeah,
Okay.
in Louisiana.
And he really didn't, I mean, the excerpt that you had, he really didn't seem to have much compassion
No,
in that situation.
He felt like they could be moving faster if only if only they had a lieutenant there who could, you know, discipline them. He had a group of about 10 or 12 men who were sent up from New Orleans to basically do all the grunt work, set up camp, and you know, at this time they weren't taking a steamboat. You know, they were on basically a raft kind of boat that they were using poles to push themselves up and using ropes to pull themselves up the river against the stream. And there were lots of places where they ran into sandbars and gravel, and certainly, but once they got closer to hot springs, you know, they were encountering all kinds of cataracts and small waterfalls and that sort of thing.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, well, we wait on that. Thank you for taking the time to share your work with us, and maybe you'll be able to come and present in real life next time.
Yeah, I hope so. That'd be great.
Yes, and thank you. Oh, people are thanking you. And we hope that you're able to attend other sessions. And remember, you can buy this book as well as the others at Wordsworth Books, or you can look on the Six Bridges Book Festival website, and we'll post that so that you can link to that. So you can buy these books. And thank you again, Dr. Milson.
Thank you, Marcie.
Thank you.